My husband walked into our family dinner with my cousin on his arm, introducing her as his girlfriend to everyone. 20 minutes later, he was staring at divorce papers, his face drained of all color. The look in his eyes when he realized I knew everything? Priceless. The dining room in my parents' home had always been a place of warmth and celebration. Family photos lined the walnut shelves, capturing decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and holiday gatherings. The antique chandelier, a wedding gift from my grandmother, cast a soft golden glow over the mahogany table, polished to perfection for our annual spring reunion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood by the window, my fingers absently tracing the delicate lace curtains as I watched the driveway for approaching cars. My heart wasn't racing anymore. That phase had passed days ago when I discovered the truth. Now, a strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes after a storm when everything is broken but oddly peaceful. "Ruby, is everything all right?" My mother Rita's voice came from behind me, gentle and concerned. She'd noticed something was off the moment I arrived early to help with preparations, my usual enthusiasm replaced by quiet determination. "Everything's fine, Mom," I replied, turning to face her with a practiced smile. I'd perfected that smile over the past 5 years of marriage to Blake. Outwardly serene while inside, pieces of myself were slowly chipping away. Rita studied my face, unconvinced. After 30 years as a high school counselor, she could spot emotional armor from a mile away. "You know you can tell me anything, sweetheart." For a moment, I considered confessing everything. About finding the messages, the late-night calls, the lipstick that wasn't mine. About discovering that my husband had been having an affair with my cousin Jessica for the past 8 months. About the manila envelope tucked discreetly in my purse by the coat rack, containing documents that would end my marriage within the hour. Instead, I simply nodded. "I know, Mom. Let's make sure everything's ready. They'll be here soon." The "they" hung in the air between us. Rita didn't know that Blake and Jessica would be arriving together, that my husband had decided today was the day to bring his affair into the open, assuming I was still in the dark. He thought I'd be blindsided at this dinner. He had no idea. I was 3 steps ahead. I moved to the dining table, meticulously adjusting the placement of each fork, knife, and spoon. 14 settings for 14 people. My parents, Blake's parents, my brother Kenneth and his wife, Blake's sister Gemma and her husband, my elderly aunt and uncle, my cousins Jenna and Jessica, and of course Blake and me. One big, happy family. Except 4 of these people had been keeping a secret. Jessica, obviously. Blake, without question. But also Jenna, Jessica's sister, who had known about the affair for months and said nothing. And Gemma, Blake's sister, who had covered for him on countless occasions when he claimed to be working late. The betrayal ran deeper than just my marriage. The doorbell rang, sending a jolt through my body despite my preparation. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my navy blue dress, Blake's favorite, and tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The manila envelope seemed to pulse with energy from inside my purse. "Just a little longer." "I'll get it," I called out, moving toward the entryway with measured steps. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, I could make out 2 silhouettes standing close together. Too close. My hand hesitated on the doorknob for just a second before I pulled it open, my smile firmly in place. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. Blake stood there, his arm casually wrapped around Jessica's waist. My cousin, 3 years younger than me, with the kind of effortless beauty I'd always secretly envied, had the decency to look uncomfortable, her eyes darting everywhere but my face. Blake, however, met my gaze with a strange mix of defiance and apology. "Ruby," he said, his voice carrying a rehearsed quality. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, allowing them into the house. "Yes, I agreed. We certainly do. Everyone's almost here. Blake's eyebrows rose slightly, confused by my calm demeanor. He had expected tears, accusations, a scene at the door. My composure threw him off balance, the first crack in his carefully orchestrated plan. As they moved past me into the house, I caught the faint scent of Jessica's perfume, the same one I had given her for Christmas last year. The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother emerged from the kitchen, stopping abruptly at the sight of Blake and Jessica together. Her eyes widened, darting between them, then to me, questions forming on her lips. "Mom," I said before she could speak. "Blake has something. He wants to share with everyone over dinner. We should wait until everyone's here." Rita's gaze hardened as she looked at Blake, maternal instinct kicking in. In that moment, I knew she understood exactly what was happening, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the unconditional support I saw in her eyes. "Of course," she said, coolly. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Blake, why don't you and Jessica wait in the living room? The others should be arriving shortly." As they moved away, Rita pulled me aside, her voice a whisper. "Ruby, what's going on? Are you okay?" I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I will be, Mom. I promise. I've got this under control." And I did. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my life. The weight of suspicion and uncertainty had been lifted the moment I discovered the truth. Now, there was only the path forward. My path, without Blake, without the constant doubt and diminishment that had become the backdrop of my marriage. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of arrivals, forced pleasantries, and curious glances. Kenneth arrived with his wife, immediately sensing the tension in the air. Blake's parents followed, his father Eric clapping Blake on the shoulder, while his mother Gemma embraced Jessica with familiar affection that made my stomach turn. They knew too. The circle of deception widened with each new arrival. By the time we all gathered around the dining table, the air was thick with unspoken questions. I took my seat at one end, opposite my father, who always presided at family gatherings. Blake hesitated before sitting beside me, Jessica taking the chair next to him instead of her usual place across the table. A visible declaration. As my father began the traditional blessing of the meal, I reached for my purse beside my chair, my fingers closing around the manila envelope. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, my liberation. I'd always been the steady one, the planner, the woman with the 5-year roadmap and color-coded calendar. Ruby Edwards, née Montgomery, raised in a middle-class neighborhood, in Lakeside, where my parents had lived in the same 2-story colonial for over 30 years. The house with the blue shutters and the oak tree in the front yard, where my father had built a swing that still hung there, faded but sturdy, like the family values they had instilled in me. At 33, I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A respected position as the head librarian at Lakeside Community College. A charming craftsman home in a good neighborhood. A husband of 5 years who worked as an architect at one of the city's most prestigious firms. We were the couple friends, pointed to and said, "They've got it all figured out." What they didn't see were the cracks forming beneath the polished surface. The way Blake's ambition had gradually twisted into something darker, more selfish. The way his compliments had evolved into subtle criticisms, always delivered with a smile. "You look nice today, Ruby. That dress almost makes you look as young as you did when we met." Or, "Good job on that presentation for the library fundraiser. Maybe next time try to be a little more engaging, though. You tend to lose people's attention." Little by little, those comments had chipped away at my confidence, my sense of self. I'd started to see myself through his critical lens, as somewhat inadequate, always falling slightly short of expectations. I'd begun dressing differently, speaking differently, even thinking differently, all in an effort to meet Blake's ever-shifting standards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father offered the bowl of mashed potatoes to me, pulling me back to the present moment. Ruby, would you like to start? I accepted the bowl, spooning a small portion onto my plate before passing it to Blake. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not love. Just nothing. It was both liberating and terrifying to realize how completely my feelings for him had died. So, my father continued, oblivious to the tension humming through the room. How's the new project coming along, Blake? The Riverside development? Blake cleared his throat, setting down his water glass. It's going well, actually. We've just secured the additional funding we needed. Construction should begin next month. That's wonderful news, my mother said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Your firm must be pleased. They are, Blake replied, his confidence returning as he discussed his work. In fact, I've been put in charge of the entire East Wing design. It's a significant responsibility. I watched him as he spoke, animated and engaging. This was the Blake I had fallen in love with 8 years ago, passionate about his work, charming, focused. We'd met at a mutual friend's gallery opening. I was there supporting my college roommate whose photographs were being featured. He was there because he appreciated good architecture and design. He'd approached me as I was studying a particularly striking black and white cityscape. It's all about the negative space, he'd said, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne. The photographer understands that what isn't there is just as important as what is. I'd been intrigued by his insight, by the intensity in his hazel eyes. We'd spent the rest of the evening discussing art, architecture, and our shared love of mid-century design. By the end of the night, I'd given him my number, something I rarely did. By the end of the month, we were inseparable. The Blake sitting beside me now, casually discussing his career achievements while his hand occasionally brushed against my cousin's arm, was a stranger wearing my husband's face. And what about you, Jessica? Kenneth asked, his tone deliberately casual, though. His eyes were sharp. My brother had always been protective of me, and I suspected he'd picked up on the unusual dynamics at the table. I heard you've been spending a lot of time in the city lately. Jessica flushed slightly, glancing at Blake before answering. Yes, I've been consulting on some interior design projects. It's been keeping me busy. Interior design? My mother echoed, her eyebrow raised. I thought you were working at that marketing firm. I am, Jessica replied quickly. This is just a side project. With Blake's firm, right? I interjected, my voice calm despite the accelerated beating of my heart. You've been helping with the Riverside development. A moment of silence fell over the table. Blake's parents exchanged glances. Jenna suddenly became very interested in cutting her roast beef into perfectly equal pieces. That's right, Blake finally said, his voice steady but his fingers tightening around his fork. Jessica has a great eye for design. She's been an invaluable asset to the project. I'm sure she has, I replied, taking a sip of my water. The conversation shifted to safer topics. The unseasonably warm spring, Kenneth's new position at the hospital, my aunt's upcoming cataract surgery. But the undercurrent remained, electric, and unavoidable. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought about the night I discovered the truth. It had been so ordinary, so mundane. Blake was working late, as he often did. I was reorganizing our home office, a task I'd been putting off for months. The drawer of his desk had stuck, and when I pulled it open with extra force, several items tumbled out, including his personal tablet. It hadn't been a deliberate invasion of privacy. The device had lit up when it fell, displaying a message preview from Jessica. Just a fragment, but enough. Miss you. Can't wait until... I'd stared at those words, my mind racing to find an innocent explanation. Perhaps they were discussing a surprise for me? A family event? But deep down I knew. The suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind for months suddenly crystallized into certainty. I'd unlocked his tablet. He'd always used my birthday as his password, a fact that now seemed like a cruel joke, and found hundreds of messages spanning back 8 months. Photos. Plans to meet. Intimate conversations about their future together. Discussions about how and when to tell me. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed or thrown things or called him in a rage. Instead, I'd methodically documented everything, taking screenshots, saving them to my secure cloud storage. Then I'd carefully replaced the tablet exactly as I'd found it and continued, organizing the office as if my world hadn't just imploded. The next morning, I'd called a lawyer. By the end of the week, I had divorce papers drawn up. And when Blake mentioned the upcoming family dinner, suggesting casually that we might have something important to share with everyone, I knew exactly what he was planning, so I made plans of my own. "Ruby," Blake's mother Gemma said, drawing my attention back to the dinner table. "You're quiet tonight. Is everything all right?" I smiled at my mother-in-law, the woman who had welcomed me into her family with open arms, who had shared family recipes and traditions, and who had apparently known for months that her son was betraying me. "I'm fine, Gemma," I replied. "Just thinking about revelations. How sometimes the truth has been right in front of us all along, but we choose not to see it." Gemma's smile faltered. She glanced at her husband, then at Blake, who had stopped eating and was staring at his plate. "Sometimes," I continued, my voice carrying clearly around the suddenly quiet table, "we think we know the people closest to us, only to discover we never really knew them at all." "Ruby," Blake said, a warning note in his voice. "What is it, Blake?" I asked, turning to face him fully. "Is there something you'd like to share with everyone? Something about you and Jessica?" The table fell completely silent. All eyes moved between Blake, Jessica, and me. This was the moment, the precipice I'd been moving toward since the night I discovered their betrayal. There was no turning back now. The tension around the dining table was palpable as all eyes fixed on Blake. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat as he set down his fork with deliberate precision. This was a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, to having everyone hang on his words during client presentations and board meetings. But for once, I had seized the script from him, and his momentary fluster revealed how unprepared he was for this deviation from his carefully orchestrated plan. "I was going to wait until after dinner," Blake said, his voice regaining its usual confidence. "But since Ruby has brought it up..." He reached for Jessica's hand, placing it atop the table for everyone to see. "Jessica and I have developed feelings for each other over the past several months working together. We didn't plan for this to happen, but we've decided to be honest about our relationship." Jessica's face flushed as she stared down at her barely touched dinner. At least she had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Honest?" The word escaped my lips as a half laugh. "That's an interesting choice of words, Blake." My mother set down her glass with enough force that water sloshed over the rim. "Blake, are you telling us that you've been having an affair with Jessica? With Ruby's cousin?" Blake met my mother's gaze with practiced sincerity. "Rita, I know this is difficult to hear. Ruby and I have grown apart over the past couple of years. We've been living separate lives under the same roof. What Jessica and I have found together is real connection, something that's been missing from my marriage for a long time." I marveled at how easily he rewrote our history, painting our marriage as a hollow shell, when just last week we'd hosted his colleagues for dinner, his arm draped possessively around my shoulders as he'd introduced me as my incredible wife, the backbone of our home. The same week he'd taken Jessica to the lakeside cabin that had been a wedding gift from my parents. "How long?" My father's voice cut through the room, deep and controlled but with an edge I rarely heard. How long has this been going on? Blake shifted slightly in his chair. Dad, I understand you're upset. I'm not your dad, my father interrupted coldly. Answer the question. Jessica spoke for the first time, her voice small. 8 months. 8 months. The same time frame I'd discovered in those messages. At least they weren't lying about that. 8 months, I repeated, nodding slowly. 8 months during which Blake and I celebrated our 5th anniversary, during which we discussed starting a family, during which we attended Jessica's birthday party, together, and I gave her that perfume she's wearing right now. Jenna, Jessica's sister, suddenly looked ill. She had known all along. I'd seen the messages between them where Jessica had confided in her, where Jenna had offered advice on how to break it to Ruby gently. Yet she'd sat across from me at our monthly family brunches, smiling and chatting about summer vacation plans as if she wasn't harboring this secret. Ruby, Blake's voice softened as he turned to me, adopting the sympathetic tone he used with difficult clients. I never meant to hurt you. These things, they just happen sometimes. People change. They grow apart. I think deep down, you felt it too. 5 years earlier, I might have believed him. 3 years earlier, I might have blamed myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed to keep his interest. 1 year earlier, I might have broken down in tears, begging him to reconsider, to give our marriage another chance. But the Ruby sitting at the table that evening was not the same woman who had walked down the aisle in a lace gown with stars in her eyes. That Ruby had gradually disappeared, eroded by 1,000 small moments of dismissal, of subtle undermining, of being made to feel that her thoughts and feelings were somehow less valid than his. The Blake I married had been charming, attentive, passionate about his work but equally invested in our relationship. He brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. He listened attentively when I talked about my work at the library. He made plans for our future that always included we and us and our. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. The change was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. The Sunday coffees became less frequent, then stopped altogether. My stories about work were interrupted with his more important projects. Our future plans became his career trajectory, with my role reduced to supportive spouse. What exactly did you think would happen tonight, Blake? I asked, genuinely curious. You bring my cousin to my parents' house, announce you're leaving me for her, and then what? We all enjoy dessert together? Blake's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to his script. I thought we could discuss this like adults, Ruby. I was planning to tell you privately before dinner, but you arrived early and were busy with preparations. How considerate of you, I replied. And where were you planning to have this private conversation? In my parents' guest bathroom? Or perhaps in the garden where we took our engagement photos? Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside him. Maybe we should continue this another time, she suggested quietly. This is a family dinner and what exactly do you think you are, Jessica? Kenneth interjected, his patience visibly fraying. You are family. Our cousin. Ruby's cousin. Did that not factor into your decision at any point during these 8 months? Jessica flinched as if she'd been slapped. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost Blake's mother finally broke her silence. Blake, this isn't how we raised you, she said, disappointment evident in her voice. You've handled this terribly. Mom, please, Blake replied, exasperation creeping into his tone. I'm trying to do the right thing by being honest now. Now? My father's laugh was hollow. After 8 months? That's not honesty, son. That's damage control because you got caught. I didn't get caught, Blake insisted, glancing at me with sudden suspicion. Ruby and I have been having problems for a long time. This isn't about Jessica. This is about our marriage not working anymore. It was always the same with Blake. Reframe the narrative, shift the blame. make it seem like circumstances beyond his control had forced his hand. In his mind, he was always the reasonable one, the victim of others' emotions or expectations. I'd watched him do it for years with clients, with colleagues, with friends. I just never thought I'd be on the receiving end of his manipulation so blatantly. "Our marriage not working anymore," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that the phrase you settled on? Not, 'I betrayed my wife with her cousin,' or 'I've been lying to everyone for the better part of a year'?" "Ruby, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be," Blake said, his patience visibly thinning. "People fall out of love. Marriages end. It happens every day." "You're right," I agreed, surprising him. "It does happen every day. In fact, it's happening right now." This was it, the moment I'd been planning for since discovering those messages. I reached down beside my chair for my purse, feeling the weight of the manila envelope inside. 5 years of marriage reduced to legal documents and signatures. Blake's eyes followed my movement, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. This wasn't part of his plan. In his version of tonight's events, he would reveal his relationship. With Jessica, I would be stunned and emotional, and he would magnanimously offer to give me time to process. He would appear reasonable while I appeared hysterical. He would control the narrative while I struggled to catch up. But I was already 5 steps ahead of him. And for the first time in our marriage, Blake was about to discover what it felt like to be completely blindsided. The dining room fell silent as I pulled the manila envelope from my purse. It made a soft thud as I placed it on the table between the roast beef and mashed potatoes. Blake's eyes fixed on it, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "What is that?" he asked, though I could tell from the sudden pallor of his face that he already suspected. "Why don't you open it and find out?" I suggested, my voice remarkably steady despite the thundering of my heart. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle ticking of my mother's antique grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the seconds of this suspended moment. Then slowly, Blake reached for the envelope, his fingers hesitating before finally grasping it. I watched as he opened the flap and slid out the documents, their crisp, official letterhead stark against the warm wood of the dining table. His eyes scanned the first page, widening slightly as they reached the bold heading. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." "Divorce papers," he said flatly, looking up at me with genuine shock. "You filed for divorce." 3 days ago, I confirmed. "My lawyer said you should be officially served next week, but I thought this would be more efficient, given our gathered audience." Jessica leaned over to look at the papers, her hand flying to her mouth. "Blake, did you know about this?" He shook, his head slowly, still staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "No," he said quietly. "I had no idea." My father cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give you two some privacy to discuss this." "That won't be necessary, Dad," I said, never taking my eyes off Blake. "There's nothing to discuss that can't be said in front of everyone. After all, Blake and Jessica were planning to announce their relationship tonight. I'm simply adding my own announcement to the agenda." Blake shuffled through the papers, his architectural precision reasserting itself as he methodically reviewed each page. "You've already divided our assets," he noted, his voice tight with disbelief. "You've outlined custody arrangements for the dogs. You've even—" He paused, swallowing hard. "You've even specified that I can keep the lakeside cabin if I buy out your half of its value." "My lawyer thought it was best to be thorough," I explained. "It should make for a cleaner break. Assuming you find the terms agreeable, of course." "Ruby," my mother-in-law interjected, her voice strained. "Don't you think you're being hasty? Perhaps with some counseling—" "Gemma," I cut her off gently. "When did you find out about Blake and Jessica?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Gemma's face flushed as she exchanged a quick glance with her husband. She hesitated. I'm not sure what you mean. Please don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else, I said quietly. I know Blake confided in you. I'd just like to know when. After a moment's hesitation, Gemma sighed. About 4 months ago. But Ruby, he was confused, and we advised him to end things with Jessica and recommit to your marriage. Obviously, that advice didn't take, Kenneth muttered. Blake ignored his comment, still staring at the divorce papers. How did you find out? He finally asked. About Jessica and me. How long have you known? Does it matter? I countered. Yes, he insisted, looking up at me. It matters to me. I considered deflecting again, but something in his expression, perhaps genuine curiosity rather than his usual strategic probing, made me decide to tell him the truth. 3 weeks ago, I said. I found your messages while organizing the office, all of them, including the ones where you discussed the Riverside apartment you've been furnishing together, the ones where you planned weekend getaways while telling me you were at business conferences, the ones where you complained about how stifling your marriage had become. Jessica blanched, no doubt remembering the specific content of some of those exchanges. Blake's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Jenna seemed to find her water glass utterly fascinating. I see, Blake said after a moment, setting the papers down carefully. And you've been planning this ambush ever since. There, it was, the first attempt to reframe, to make me the villain in his narrative. Classic Blake. Ambush? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's an interesting characterization from the man who brought his girlfriend to a family dinner to announce he was leaving his wife. I was trying to be respectful, Blake insisted, his voice rising slightly. I wanted to tell you privately first, but then planned to be honest with everyone, rather than hiding or sneaking around anymore. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Respectful? You've been sneaking around for 8 months, Blake. With my cousin. In what universe is any of that respectful? Blake's jaw tightened, a familiar sign that his patience was wearing thin. He'd always hated being challenged, especially publicly. You know what I mean, Ruby? I was trying to handle this with dignity. Whose dignity? My father asked sharply. Certainly not my daughter's. Sir, with all due respect, this is between Ruby and me, Blake replied, his professional demeanor slipping back into place. We've grown apart. These things happen. I never intended to hurt anyone. I studied him, this man I had loved, trying to see if he genuinely believed his own words or if he knew he was spinning fiction. It was hard to tell. Blake had always been skilled at convincing himself of whatever narrative best served his interests. You know what the saddest part is? I said finally. I don't even think you're lying right now. I think you've convinced yourself that this was somehow inevitable, that you had no agency in it, that it just happened. As if having an affair with my cousin for 8 months was something that occurred to you rather than something you actively chose, day after day. Ruby, Jessica began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. No, Jessica. You don't get to speak right now. Not after sitting across from me at Sunday brunches, asking about my marriage, offering me advice on romantic weekend ideas for Blake's birthday, all while sleeping with my husband. You've said quite enough over the past 8 months. Jessica's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, just a vast emptiness where my feelings for these people had once resided. Blake reached for the divorce papers again, flipping to the last page where a line awaited his signature. For a moment, I thought he might sign them then and there, bringing our marriage to its official end amidst the half-eaten dinner and stunned family members. Instead, he carefully slid the papers back into the envelope and set it down between us. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The shock had faded, replaced by something cooler, more calculated. This was Blake the negotiator, Blake the strategist, the version of my husband I'd learned to be wary of over the years. I'll buy Need to review these with my lawyer, he said calmly. The terms seem reasonable at first glance, but there may be details to discuss. In the meantime, he turned to Jessica, who was still fighting back tears. Perhaps we should go. That's it? Kenneth asked incredulously. Your wife hands you divorce papers after you brought your mistress to family dinner, and your response is, I'll have my lawyer look these over? Blake stood, straightening his suit jacket with practiced precision. What would you have me do, Kenneth? Create a scene? Ruby has clearly made her decision, and she's entitled to that. I'm simply respecting her choice. And there it was again. The reframing, the subtle shift in narrative. Suddenly, he was the reasonable one, graciously accepting my decision rather than facing the consequences of his actions. It was masterful, really. If I hadn't spent years watching him work, I might have missed it entirely. Blake, I said as he pulled out Jessica's chair, you forgot something. He paused, looking back at me with a raised eyebrow. What's that? I gestured to the envelope. Your copy of the divorce papers. You'll need them for your lawyer. After Blake and Jessica left, the dining room remained suspended in uncomfortable silence. My mother busied herself clearing plates that were still half full, a nervous energy propelling her movements. My father sat motionless, his hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the space where the divorce papers had been. Kenneth had stepped outside to get some air, though I suspected he was more likely calling his wife to fill her in on the evening's dramatic turn. Ruby, my aunt finally ventured, her voice gentle. Are you all right, dear? Was I all right? It seemed like such a simple question, yet I found myself unable to formulate a coherent answer. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a strange hollowness that wasn't quite pain, wasn't quite relief, just emptiness where something vital used to be. I think I need a moment, I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. Excuse me. I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, preserved like a time capsule from my high school and college years. Academic trophies still lined the bookshelf. Faded photographs of long-ago friends were still tucked into the frame of the mirror. The twin bed was still covered with the purple quilt my grandmother had made for my 16th birthday. Closing the door behind me, I sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing my carefully constructed facade to crumble. My hands, steady, throughout dinner, now trembled as I pressed them against my face. The tears I'd been holding back didn't come, though. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life falling apart rather than my own. I glanced, around the room, at the artifacts of a younger Ruby who had dreamed of love that looked nothing like what my marriage had become. That Ruby had believed in partnership, in mutual respect, in growing together rather than apart. She had trusted that love when real didn't fade or transform into whatever twisted thing Blake had offered in its place. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Blake. We need to talk, just the two of us. This isn't how this should end. I stared at the message, noting how perfectly it encapsulated Blake's approach to our entire relationship. We need to talk. Not I'm sorry, or I was wrong, or any acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Just the assumption that if he could get me alone, he could control the narrative once more. This isn't how this should end. As if there were a proper protocol for concluding a marriage destroyed by betrayal. As if my deviation from his script was the true offense, rather than his 8-month affair with my cousin. I didn't respond, instead setting the phone face down on the nightstand. Blake had monopolized enough of my emotional energy. I wouldn't give him a single moment more tonight. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Ruby? It's Mom. May I come in? Yes, I called, straightening my posture and tucking a TI strand of hair behind my ear, reflexive gestures of composure that seemed pointless now. Rita entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She set them on the nightstand and sat beside me on the bed, close enough for comfort, but not so close as to crowd me. My mother had always understood the delicate balance of support and space. Chamomile. With honey? She said, nodding toward the mugs. Just like when you were little and had a bad day at school. A smile tugged at my lips despite everything. Some things never change. And some things do, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes they have to. We sat in silence for a moment, the familiar scent of chamomile filling the room. Outside, I could hear muffled voices as the remaining dinner guests presumably discussed the evening's revelations. I wondered what consensus they were reaching, whose side they were taking, whether any of it really mattered anymore. How long have you known? Rita finally asked, her eyes searching my face. That something wasn't right between you and Blake? I considered the question, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when doubt had first crept in. Had it been when Blake started working late without explanation? When he began criticizing my clothes, my friends, my interests? When intimacy became rare, then perfunctory, then non-existent? I think part of me has known for at least a year, I admitted. But I kept making excuses, blaming his stress at work, or my own insecurities. It was easier than facing the truth. Rita nodded, understanding in her eyes. And Jessica? When did you suspect her involvement? I didn't, I said simply. Not until I found the messages. That part was unexpected. My mother's face tightened, anger flickering across her features. Of all people, your own cousin, in our home, at our family gatherings, all this time. Mom, I interrupted gently. It doesn't matter who it was. If it hadn't been Jessica, it would have been someone else. The problem wasn't her, it was Blake. It was our marriage. It was a realization that had crystallized for me during those sleepless nights after discovering the affair. Jessica's betrayal hurt, of course. The family complications made everything messier, more painful. But ultimately, she was a symptom, not the disease itself. The real illness had been growing in my marriage long before she entered the picture. You're right, Rita conceded after a moment. But that doesn't make what she did any less despicable. I reached for my mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. No, it doesn't. But focusing on her betrayal feels beside the point now. I'm more concerned with how I didn't see what was happening in my own marriage, how I let things deteriorate so badly without confronting them. You can't blame yourself for his choices, Ruby. I'm not, I assured her. Blake's actions are his, responsibility alone. But I am responsible for how long I allowed myself to be diminished, for how much of myself I surrendered trying to be what he wanted. Rita's eyes glistened with unshed tears. When did that start? The diminishment? The question struck me with unexpected force. When had it started? Not all at once, certainly. There had been no single moment I could point to and say, that's when I began to disappear. It had been gradual, insidious. I think it started with small things, I said slowly, memories surfacing. Comments about my clothes being too conservative, suggestions that my job was less important than his, jokes at my expense when we were with friends that I laughed off because I didn't want to seem oversensitive. I took a sip of tea, organizing my thoughts. Then it progressed to bigger things. He started making decisions without consulting me. Financial. Choices, vacation plans, even which friends we'd maintain relationships with. If I objected, he'd make me feel irrational or difficult. Why didn't you say something? My mother asked, her voice pained. To me? To your father? To anyone? I smiled sadly. Because I was embarrassed. Because admitting there were problems meant acknowledging that the life I'd been presenting to everyone, this perfect marriage, this perfect partnership, was a facade. And because part of me believed I really was the problem, That if I could just be better, more supportive, more understanding, things would improve. Oh, Ruby, Rita sighed, reaching for my hand. You've always been so independent, so strong-willed. I never imagined you could be made to feel that way. Neither did I admitted. But it happens so slowly you hardly notice. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already lost. We fell silent again, the weight of my words settling between us. Downstairs, I could hear the front door opening and closing as guests presumably departed. The evening thoroughly ruined by Blake's revelation and my countermove with the divorce papers. What happens now? My mother finally asked. It was the question I'd been asking myself for 3 weeks ever since finding those messages. What happens after you dismantle the life you've spent 5 years building? Where do you go when the future you'd planned suddenly evaporates? Now, I rebuild, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. I figure out who Ruby is without Blake, what she wants, what she dreams about, what makes her happy. And the divorce? My lawyer thinks it will be straightforward since we don't have children. Blake might contest some of the asset division, but the prenup limits how much he can fight. 3 months, maybe 6, and it will be final. Rita squeezed my hand. You seem remarkably calm about all this. I've had 3 weeks to process, I reminded her. 3 weeks of anger, grief, shock, planning. Tonight was just the execution of those plans. Well, you certainly executed them effectively, she said, a hint of pride breaking through her concern. The look on Blake's face when you pulled out those divorce papers. For the first time since the confrontation, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. Not vindictive pleasure at Blake's discomfort, but satisfaction at having reclaimed some measure of control over my own narrative. For once, I had been the one to act rather than react, to lead rather than follow. It wasn't about humiliating him, I said, though part of me recognized there had been a certain poetic justice to the evening's events. It was about taking back my power, about refusing to be the passive recipient of his decisions any longer. Morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of my childhood bedroom, casting soft patterns across the purple quilt. I'd spent the night there, unable to face returning to the home I shared with Blake. The twin bed had been too small, the room too filled with teenage memories, but somehow it had felt safer than the king-sized emptiness waiting for me across town. I reached for my phone, wincing at the barrage of notifications that had accumulated overnight. 3 missed calls and 7 texts from Blake, 2 voice messages from Jessica, a string of supportive messages from friends who had already heard about last night's dinner. News traveled fast in our tight-knit community. A particularly colorful text from Kenneth promising to knock some sense into that architectural ass, if I gave the word. Ignoring them all, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded to the adjoining bathroom. The face that greeted me in the mirror was pale, but composed, eyes clear despite the minimal sleep. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it fully awakening me to the reality of my new situation. I was getting divorced. The thought landed differently in the morning light. Last night, it had been a tactical move, a calculated response to Blake's betrayal. This morning, it was simply my future. Uncertain, unplanned, but undeniably mine. I borrowed a robe from the back of the bathroom door and made my way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and the low murmur of voices. My parents were in the kitchen, my father at the table with his reading glasses perched on his nose as he scrutinized the morning paper. My mother at the stove flipping pancakes with practiced precision. It was so achingly normal, so reminiscent of countless childhood mornings that for a moment I felt disoriented, as if the last 15 years had been merely a dream. "Good morning," I said, my voice still rough with sleep. They both looked up, concern immediately replacing the comfortable domesticity of the moment. "Ruby," my mother said, abandoning her pancakes to pull me into a fierce hug. "How did you sleep, sweetheart?" "As well as could be expected," I replied, extricating myself gently to pour a cup of coffee. "What time is it?" "Just after 9, my father answered, setting aside his newspaper. "You needed the rest." I nodded, taking a long sip of coffee and feeling its warmth spread through me. "Has anyone called this morning?" My parents exchanged a glance that told me everything I needed to know. "Blake stopped by about an hour ago," my father admitted, his tone carefully neutral. "I told him you were still sleeping and that it would be best if he gave you some space." "Did he leave peacefully?" I asked, knowing Blake's persistence when he set his mind to something. "Eventually," my father said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, suggesting there might have been more to the exchange than he was letting on. "He said he'd be at your house this afternoon if you wanted to talk." Our house. The craftsman with the blue door and the garden I'd spent 3 summers perfecting. The place where we'd built a life, hosted dinner parties, argued over paint colors and furniture arrangements. Now it was just another asset to be divided, another piece of the past to be dismantled. "I'm not ready to see him yet," I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "I need time to figure things out." My mother returned to her pancakes, flipping the last batch onto a waiting plate. "Take all the time you need, honey. You can stay here as long as you want." The offer was tempting, to retreat into the safety of my parents' home, to let them shield me from the aftermath of last night's revelations. But as I stared into my coffee cup, watching the light play across its dark surface, I knew that wasn't the path forward. "Thanks, Mom, but I can't hide here. I need to face this head on." "No one would blame you for taking a breather," my father said gently. "After what Blake did—" "It's not about Blake," I interrupted, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. "Or at least, it's not just about him, it's about me, about what I need to do next." I set my coffee cup down and moved to the window, gazing out at the familiar backyard where I'd spent countless hours reading under the old oak tree. The tree was still there, its branches now fuller, stronger than in my childhood memories. It had continued growing all these years, even as I'd been slowly allowing myself to be diminished. "For so long, I've been reacting to Blake," I said, more to myself than to my parents. Adjusting to his needs, his expectations, his timeline. Even finding those messages and filing for divorce, that was still a reaction to him rather than a choice for myself. My mother set a plate of pancakes on the table, her expression thoughtful. "And now?" "Now I need to decide what I want. Not in opposition to Blake, not as a response to his betrayal, but for myself. Because I've spent so long being Blake's wife that I'm not sure I remember who Ruby is anymore." The words hung in the air, startling in their honesty. It was a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Standing in my parents' kitchen with the remnants of my marriage scattered behind me like debris after a storm. Who was Ruby without Blake? What did she want from life? What made her happy, angry, passionate, fulfilled? I had answers once before I began subtly reshaping myself to fit the contours of Blake's expectations. But now those answers seemed distant, like half-remembered dreams. My father rose from his chair, moving to stand beside me at the window. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I've always known exactly who Ruby is. She's the same determined girl who refused training wheels at age 4. The same stubborn teenager who applied to 7 colleges even though her heart was set on just one. The same compassionate woman who reads to nursing home residents every Thursday afternoon because, and I quote, "stories matter most to those who can no longer tell their own." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes. "Dad, you're still in there, Ruby," he continued, his voice gruff with emotion. "Blake didn't erase you. He might have convinced you to turn down your volume for a while, but he never changed your fundamental frequency." The metaphor was so perfectly my father, A retired radio engineer who had always spoken about people as if they were broadcasting signals, that a laugh escaped me, watery but genuine. "Your father's right," my mother added, joining us by the window. "You just need to readjust your tuning, find your true signal again." I looked between them, these two people who had loved me consistently, unconditionally for 33 years, who had watched me grow, stumble, succeed, fail, and keep moving forward, who had never once suggested I make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. I said slowly, I need to get away for a while. Not to hide, but to find some perspective, some quiet to hear myself think. "The cabin," my mother suggested immediately. "Your great-aunt's place in the mountains. It's been empty since she moved to Arizona last year. The family cabin. A simple, rustic structure nestled in the mountains about 3 hours north. I'd spent summers there as a child, and a few weekends in recent years when life in the city became too hectic. It was isolated but not remote, peaceful but not desolate. Perfect. That's actually a really good idea," I admitted. "I could take a week off work, bring some books, do some thinking." "When would you go?" my father asked. I considered the question, mentally reviewing my work calendar, the pending divorce proceedings, the lease on my house that would need attention soon. "Today," I decided, the word landing with unexpected certainty. "I'll go today." My parents exchanged surprised glances. "Today?" my mother echoed. "But don't you need to pack? Make arrangements at work? Talk to your lawyer?" "I can pack in an hour. I have vacation days accumulated. My lawyer doesn't need me physically present for at least 2 weeks." The plan was forming rapidly now, each piece falling into place with satisfying clarity. And, most importantly, I need to be somewhere Blake can't find me while I sort through all of this. My father nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're afraid he'll try to change your mind?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Not afraid, exactly. I know I won't take him back, not after this. But Blake has always been persuasive. He knows exactly which emotional levers to pull, which insecurities to exploit. I'd rather not subject myself to that right now." "Then it's settled," my mother said with characteristic decisiveness. "I'll call Maureen to make sure the cabin's stocked with essentials. Your father can drive you up this afternoon." "Mom, I can drive myself." "Of course you can," she interrupted, already reaching for her phone. "But humor me. Let your father drive you, just this once. He'll bring your car back here so Blake won't know where you've gone if he comes looking." The protective instinct behind her words both touched and amused me. My mother, the former high school English teacher with a spine of steel, was ready to orchestrate an entire covert operation to shield me from my soon-to-be ex-husband. "All right," I conceded. "Dad can drive me, but first I need to go home and pack." And I hesitated, realizing what that meant, and potentially face Blake. My father's expression hardened. "I'll come with you." "We both will," my mother added, firmly. The drive to my house, our house, was silent, the weight of anticipation making conversation impossible. My father drove with both hands firmly on the wheel, his usual relaxed posture replaced by a vigilant stiffness. My mother sat in the back seat, one hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. Their protective energy surrounded me like a shield as we pulled into the driveway of the craftsman home Blake and I had purchased 3 years ago. To my immense relief, Blake's sleek black Audi was nowhere in sight. Perhaps he'd given up waiting for me after my father had turned him away earlier. Or perhaps he was holed up at Jessica's apartment, strategizing his next move. Either way, his absence was a gift I hadn't dared hope for. "He might still show up," my father warned as he cut the engine. "Your mother and I will be right with you." "I know, Dad," I said, squeezing his hand. "But I need to do this part myself. Could you both wait here? Just for a few minutes while I go in first? My parents exchanged concerned glances. Ruby, are you sure? My mother asked. I nodded. I need to see it alone. To feel whatever I'm going to feel without worrying about how it affects you, both. After a moment's hesitation, my father nodded. 10 minutes, then we're coming in. Fair enough, I agreed, stepping out of the car. The walk to the front door felt surreal, as if I were approaching a movie set of my life rather than the actual place I'd called home for 3 years. I inserted my key with steady hands, surprised by my own composure, and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it yesterday morning. Coffee mug in the sink, mail stacked neatly on the entryway table, Blake's running shoes kicked off. By the door. So ordinary, so mundane, that for a moment I questioned whether last night had really happened. Perhaps I'd imagined the whole thing, the dinner, the confrontation, the divorce papers. Perhaps Blake would walk through the door any minute, kiss me hello, and ask about my day as if everything were normal. But the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter, identical to the one I'd presented at dinner, but empty now that Blake had taken the divorce papers, confirmed the reality of my situation. This wasn't a dream or a hallucination. My marriage was over, and I was standing in the wreckage. I moved through the house methodically, gathering essentials for my retreat to the mountains. Clothes, toiletries, the journal I'd been neglecting for months, the stack of books on my nightstand that I'd been meaning to read but never found time for. I worked quickly, efficiently, not allowing myself to linger on memories or sentiment, until I reached the bathroom and saw them side by side on the counter. Blake's expensive shaving cream next to my facial cleanser, his toothbrush touching. Mine in the holder, his towel hanging beside mine on the rack. The casual intimacy of these everyday objects struck me with unexpected force. This was what marriage looked like in its most basic form. The sharing of space, the intertwining of daily rituals, the physical evidence of two lives merged into one. And now I was dismantling it, piece by piece. A sound from downstairs jolted me from my thoughts, the unmistakable click of the front door opening and closing. My parents wouldn't have come in without calling up to me first, which meant, Ruby? Blake's voice floated up the stairs, tentative yet insistent. Your car wasn't at your parents' place. I figured you might be here. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself against the bathroom counter. So much for my hope of avoiding this confrontation. I'm upstairs, I called back, my voice surprisingly strong. I'm just getting some things. His footsteps on the stairs were measured, deliberate. I stepped out of the bathroom to meet him in the bedroom, refusing to be cornered in a smaller space. Blake appeared in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. His eyes were bloodshot, his 5 o'clock shadow now a full stubble. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, completely undone. You didn't answer my calls, he said, a note of accusation in his voice. No, I agreed simply. I didn't. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his gaze moving from my face to the half-packed suitcase on the bed. You're leaving. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, I need some time away. With him? Blake asked, a bitter edge to his words. For a moment I was genuinely confused. With who? Whoever you've been seeing. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You found someone else and now you're using Jessica as an excuse to end our marriage? The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly in line with Blake's tendency to deflect and project, that a startled laugh escaped me. Are you serious right now? It makes sense, he continued, warming to his theory. The sudden divorce papers, the calm way you handled everything last night. You've already moved on. Blake, I said firmly, I am not seeing anyone. I didn't cheat on you. You cheated on me. With my cousin. For 8 months. He flinched slightly at the blunt recitation of facts. It wasn't. It's more complicated than that. No, it's really not, I countered, zipping my suitcase closed with finality. It's actually quite simple. You betrayed our marriage. You lied to me repeatedly for the better part of a year. And now you're trying to make this somehow about me. That's not what I'm doing, he protested, moving further into the room. I'm just trying to understand why you're being so cold, so calculated about all this. What did you expect, Blake? Tears? Begging? A complete emotional breakdown? I expected my wife to at least talk to me before serving me with divorce papers in front of my entire family. And I expected my husband not to sleep with my cousin, I shot back. I guess we're both dealing with disappointment. Blake's expression hardened, the vulnerability of a moment ago vanishing behind the familiar mask of controlled displeasure I'd grown to recognize over the years. He moved toward me, stopping just short of invading my personal space. Close enough to be intimidating, but not so close that I could accuse him of threatening me. It was a calculated distance, like everything else about him. You're being unreasonable, he said, his voice dropping to that quiet, intense register he used when he wanted to appear both rational and wounded. I made a mistake, a serious one, yes. But does that really justify ending 5 years of marriage without even attempting to work through it? I held my ground, refusing to step back despite the urge to create more distance between us. 8 months isn't a mistake, Blake. It's a choice you made, day after day. And yes, some choices are irreversible. People overcome affairs all the time, he persisted. Couples go to counseling, they rebuild trust, they come out stronger. Those couples don't involve a husband sleeping with his wife's cousin, I pointed out. And more importantly, those couples actually want to save their marriage. A flicker of genuine hurt crossed his face. And you don't? The simple question hung in the air between us, demanding an answer I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, until this moment. Did I want to save my marriage? Was there anything left worth salvaging from the wreckage of Blake's betrayal? No, I said finally, the truth of it settling into my bones. I don't. Blake took a step back, as if physically struck by my words. You can't mean that. We've built a life together, Ruby. One indiscretion. 8 months is not an indiscretion, I interrupted. And it's not just about Jessica. It's about who you've become, who I've become when I'm with you. What does that even mean? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I searched for words to explain the slow erosion of self I'd experienced, the gradual diminishment that had happened so subtly I'd barely noticed until it was nearly complete. Do you remember when we first met? I asked. At that gallery opening? Blake's expression softened slightly at the memory. Of course. You were wearing that green dress with the gold necklace. Your hair was longer then. And I was talking about that photograph, the cityscape with the abandoned building in the foreground, I continued. I was saying how the photographer had captured both decay and possibility in the same frame. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. You were so passionate about it. I thought you might be an art critic. That's who I was, Blake. Someone with opinions and passion and a voice. I gestured between us. But somewhere along the way, in this marriage, I stopped being that person. I became smaller, quieter, more careful not to contradict or challenge you. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. You've always been free to express yourself. Have I? When was the last time you actually asked what I thought about something important? When was the last time you listened, really listened, without dismissing or correcting me? Blake opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to produce a concrete example. The truth is, I continued, I've spent years trying to be the version of me that you wanted. The supportive wife who never questions your decisions. The perfect hostess for your work colleagues. The woman who overlooks your late nights at the office and doesn't make demands on your time or attention. You're making me sound like some kind of monster, Blake protested. I've always supported your career, your interests. As long as they didn't interfere with yours, I finished for him. As long as they didn't require you to make any significant adjustments to your life. Before Blake could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed from downstairs, followed by my father's voice calling up. Ruby, your 10 minutes are up. Blake's expression darkened. You brought your parents? To our house? They drove me here, I explained, reaching for my suitcase. I'm staying with them for now. This is absurd, he muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. You're acting like a child running home to mommy and daddy instead of facing our problems like an adult. The condescension in his tone was so familiar, so predictable that it almost made me laugh. Even now, confronted with the consequences of his own actions, he couldn't resist trying to make me feel immature and irrational. No, Blake, I said calmly. I'm acting like a woman who knows her own worth, who refuses to stay in a marriage with someone who doesn't respect her enough to remain faithful, who's finally setting boundaries after years of having them ignored or dismissed. Footsteps on the stairs announced my parents' approach. Blake glanced toward the hallway, his jaw tightening as he realized our private conversation was about to be interrupted. Where are you going? He asked, his voice lower now, urgent. Your mother said you were taking some time away. Where? That's not your concern anymore, I replied, lifting my suitcase from the bed. The hell it isn't, he snapped, the polished veneer finally cracking to reveal the anger beneath. You're still my wife. I have a right to know where you'll be. You forfeited that right when you started sleeping with my cousin, I said simply. My father appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral but his stance protective. Everything okay in here? Fine, Dad, I assured him. I'm ready to go. Blake looked between us, realization dawning that he was losing control of the situation, and of me. It was a novel experience for him, I imagined, this sensation of powerlessness. Ruby. Please, he said, his tone softening again, pivoting seamlessly from anger to appeal. Just give me a chance to explain everything properly, without an audience. We owe our marriage at least that much. For a brief moment, I felt the familiar pull of his persuasion, the well-practiced sincerity in his eyes, the perfectly calibrated note of humility in his voice. How many times had I yielded to that combination in the past, setting aside my own needs or concerns because he made such a convincing case for his? No, Blake, I said quietly but firmly. The time for explanations was before you decided to betray our marriage, before you brought my cousin to a family dinner to announce you were leaving me, before you made me feel like I was somehow deficient for years. I moved past him toward the door, suitcase in hand. My lawyer will be in touch about the next steps in the divorce proceedings. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you didn't contact me. You can't just walk away, he called after me, a note of desperation finally breaking through his controlled facade. We need to talk about this. I paused at the top of the stairs, turning to face him one last time. That's the thing, Blake. For the first time in years, I don't need to do anything you say, and it feels absolutely liberating. The 3-hour drive to the mountain cabin passed mostly in silence. My father focused on the winding roads as we climbed higher into the mountains, while I stared out the window at the passing landscape. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, and finally to the dense pine forests that signaled our approach to the family's mountain retreat. My mind, however, was still back at the house, replaying my confrontation with Blake. His shifting tactics, from accusation to appeal, from self-righteousness to vulnerability, were so predictable that I could almost chart them on a graph. What surprised me was my own response, the clarity and strength I'd found to resist his manipulations. Where had that version of me been hiding all these years? You're quiet, my father observed as we turned onto the gravel road that led to the, second thoughts? No, I said firmly. Just processing. It's strange to realize how easily I fell into certain patterns with Blake, how I learned to accommodate his moods, his needs, his expectations, often at the expense of my own. My father nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes we don't notice the water rising until we're nearly drowning. That's exactly it, I agreed. It was so gradual. A small compromise here, a minor concession there. By the time I realized how much of myself I'd surrendered, it seemed easier to keep surrendering than to fight for that lost ground. And now? He asked, glancing at me briefly before returning his attention to the increasingly rugged road. Now, I take it back, I said simply. All of it. Starting with this week. The cabin appeared around the next bend, its weathered cedar exterior blending harmoniously with the surrounding forest. It wasn't large or luxurious, just a sturdy two-bedroom structure with a spacious living area, a modest kitchen, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But it represented something I desperately needed. Space to think, to plan, to rediscover the woman I'd been before Blake began reshaping me into his ideal wife. My great-aunt Maureen had lived here year-round, until her arthritis made the isolation impractical. Now she lived in a retirement community in Arizona, and the cabin served as a family retreat. I hadn't visited in over a year. Blake had always preferred more sophisticated vacation destinations, but as we pulled up to the familiar building, I felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the structure itself, and everything to do with the freedom it represented. "Your mother called Maureen," my father said as he cut the engine. "She had the caretaker stock the fridge and make sure everything's working. You should be all set for at least a week." "Thanks, Dad," I said, squeezing his hand. "For everything, we unloaded my suitcase and a box of additional supplies my mother had insisted on packing, just in case, and carried them into the cabin. The interior was just as I remembered. Knotty pine walls, comfortable but worn furniture, shelves lined with well-thumbed paperbacks left by various family members over the years. A faint scent of cedar and wood smoke lingered in the air, comforting and familiar. "I should head back before it gets dark," my father said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "Your mother will want a full report," I smiled, imagining my mother pacing the house, waiting for confirmation that I was safely installed in my mountain sanctuary. "Tell her I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I think this is exactly what I need right now." My father pulled me into a tight hug. "Call us if you need anything. Anything at all." "I will," I promised. After he left, the silence of the cabin enveloped me completely. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no sound but the gentle rustling of pine needles in the breeze, and the occasional call of a bird. I moved to the porch, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs that faced west toward the valley below. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape and painting the distant ridges in shades of purple and gold. For the first time since discovering Blake's betrayal, I allowed myself to be still, not planning, not reacting, not strategizing, just existing in the moment, breathing in the pine-scented air and feeling the tension in my shoulders gradually release. As darkness fell, I returned inside and unpacked my suitcase, arranging my clothes in the bedroom dresser. With methodical precision, the simple act of placing my belongings in these drawers, of claiming this space as my own, felt like a small but significant step toward reclaiming my independence. In the kitchen, I found that the caretaker had indeed stocked the refrigerator. Well, fresh produce, dairy, eggs, and other essentials filled the shelves. I made myself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, realizing as I ate that it was the first real meal I'd had since the disastrous family dinner the night before. After washing my dishes, I settled on the living room sofa with a legal pad I'd brought along. It was time to be strategic. Blake wouldn't simply accept defeat and walk away. That much was clear from our interaction at the house. He would continue pushing, manipulating, attempting to regain control of the situation. I needed to be prepared. At the top of the page, I wrote divorce strategy in bold letters. Beneath it, I began listing everything I needed to address. Legal representation. Already retained Emma Kingsley. Need to update her on recent development schedule meeting for when. I return to town financial matters. Joint accounts need to be separated. Investment portfolio division per prenup mortgage. On house retirement accounts. Living arrangements. Stay with parents. Temporarily. Find apartment or condo in town. Eventually sell house. Or buy out Blake's share. Personal items to retrieve from house. Important documents. Irreplaceable personal items. Family heirlooms communication boundaries. No direct contact with Blake if possible. All communication through lawyer's block on social media. What to tell mutual friends. Work. Considerations notify HR of name change back to Montgomery. Address potential gossip questions. Consider timing with upcoming library fundraiser. The list grew longer as I continued to think through the practical aspects of dismantling a 5-year marriage. It was overwhelming but also strangely empowering to see it laid out so clearly. These were concrete steps, actionable items that would move me from Blake's wife back to simply Ruby. When I reached the bottom of the page, I hesitated, then added one final category. Self-rediscovery. What do I want now? What did I set aside for Blake's sake? Who am I beyond this marriage? This last section was both the most important and the most daunting. The practical matters of divorce, while complex and potentially contentious, were ultimately just logistics. But rebuilding my sense of self after years of subtle erosion, that was the real challenge ahead. I stared at the page for a long time, tapping my pen against the last question. Who was I beyond this marriage? The woman who had met Blake at that gallery opening 8 years ago had been confident, opinionated, passionate about literature and art and social justice. She'd had dreams beyond being someone's wife, dreams of writing a novel someday, of traveling to literary landmarks across Europe, of perhaps even pursuing a PhD in library science. Where had those dreams gone? They hadn't vanished all at once, but had been gradually set aside as Blake's career took precedence, as his vision for our life together superseded my own ambitions. On a fresh page, I began a new list titled Reclamation. Under it, I wrote down every interest, dream, and aspect of myself that I had diminished or abandoned during my marriage. Creative writing, the short stories I used to write on weekends. Book club, quit when Blake complained it took too much time. Close friendships, especially with Megan and Diane, whom Blake found too negative. Travel preferences, literature-focused rather than Blake's preference for luxury resorts. Personal style, the vintage-inspired clothes Blake thought didn't reflect his professional image. Political engagement, the volunteer work I'd scaled back when Blake worried it might affect his clients' perceptions. The list grew longer, each item a small piece of myself I had surrendered, often so gradually and imperceptibly that I hardly noticed it happening. Looking at them now, collected on the page, I felt a complex mixture of grief for what I'd lost and determination to reclaim it all. By the time I set the legal pad aside, it was past midnight. The cabin had grown cool as the mountain air chilled, and I wrapped myself in one of the handmade quilts that had been a fixture here for as long as I could remember. Outside, the forest was alive with night sounds, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the gentle creaking of branches in the breeze. I stood by the window, looking out at the sliver of moon visible through the trees, and felt something stir within me that I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. For so long, my future had been defined by Blake's plans, Blake's ambitions, Blake's timeline. Now the path ahead was uncharted, frightening in its uncertainty, but exhilarating in its openness. For the first time in years, I could choose the direction based solely on what I wanted, what I needed. I knew the road wouldn't be easy. Blake wouldn't simply disappear from my life. The divorce proceedings would ensure that we remained connected, at least legally, for months to come. There would be challenges, both practical and emotional. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering whether I was making the right choice. But as I finally made my way to bed, sliding between cool sheets in the cabin's smaller bedroom, I felt more certain than I had in years. This wasn't just about leaving Blake, it was about finding Ruby again. And that journey, however difficult, was long overdue. For 6 days, the cabin became my sanctuary. I fell into a simple routine. Mornings spent hiking the nearby trails, afternoons dedicated to reading and writing, evenings planning my path forward. The solitude that might once have felt oppressive now felt like a gift, space to think without Blake's influence coloring my perspective, without the well-meaning but sometimes overwhelming concern of my parents. I checked in with them daily, brief calls to assure them I was safe and well. Spoke with my lawyer twice, updating her on the confrontation with Blake and confirming our strategy moving forward. But otherwise, I remained disconnected from the outside world, deliberately avoiding the barrage of texts and calls that continued to light up my phone from Blake, from Jessica, from curious friends and family members who had heard about the dramatic dinner. By the 7th day, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The mountain air, the distance, the time for reflection, all had combined to strengthen my resolve. I was ready to return, not to my old life, but to begin constructing a new one on my own terms. I packed my belongings methodically, cleaning the cabin to leave it ready for the next family member who might seek its solace. As I loaded my suitcase into my father's car, he had arranged for a friend to drive it up so I could return independently. I took one last look at the weathered structure that had sheltered me during this crucial transition. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling only slightly foolish for addressing a building. But the sentiment was genuine. This place had held space for my transformation, had witnessed my shift from confusion and hurt to determination and purpose. The drive back to town was as thoughtful as the drive up had been, but with a different quality to my reflections. No longer focused on what I was leaving behind, I found myself looking ahead, mentally preparing for the necessary confrontations and decisions that awaited me. My first stop wasn't my parents' house as they expected, but the house I had shared with Blake. I needed to retrieve important documents and personal items before the divorce proceedings advanced further. I had confirmed with my lawyer that I had every right to enter the property, as my name was still on the deed and I hadn't formally moved out. As I pulled into the driveway, I noted with relief that Blake's car wasn't there. Using my key, I entered what now felt like a stranger's home, familiar in its layout and furnishings, but foreign in its energy. I moved directly to the home office, gathering my birth certificate, passport, and other important documents from the filing cabinet. Next, I collected family heirlooms and irreplaceable personal items, my grandmother's jewelry box, photo albums from before my marriage, the first edition Austen novels my college mentor had gifted me upon graduation. I was carefully wrapping these books when I heard the front door open and close, footsteps in the entryway, then Blake's voice calling out tentatively, "Ruby, is that you? Your car's in the driveway." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This confrontation was inevitable, and perhaps it was better to have it now, on my terms, than to keep avoiding it. "In the office," I called back, continuing to pack my belongings into a small cardboard box I'd brought for this purpose. Blake appeared in the doorway, his appearance notably more disheveled than his usual impeccable standard. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, dark circles shadowing his eyes. He looked, I realized with detached interest, like a man who had genuinely suffered during my absence. "You're back," he said, stating the obvious in a way that suggested he wasn't quite prepared for this moment despite undoubtedly rehearsing it for days. "Just briefly, I clarified, sealing the box with packing tape. I'm collecting some important items. Blake's eyes moved from my face to the box, comprehension dawning. You're really going through with this? It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. He moved further into the room, maintaining a careful distance as if afraid I might bolt if he came too close. Ruby, please. Can we just talk? Really talk, without your parents or lawyers or anyone else involved? The request seemed reasonable. On its surface, what could be more natural than two married adults discussing the future of their relationship privately? But I recognized it for what it was. Blake's attempt to regain control of the narrative, to deploy his considerable persuasive skills without witnesses or buffers. There's nothing to discuss that can't be handled through our lawyers, I said, lifting the box. The division of assets, the house, all of it can be negotiated through proper channels. This isn't about assets, Blake insisted, moving to block the doorway as I approached. This is about us. 5 years of marriage. A life. We built together. You can't just throw that away without even trying to save it. I set the box down on the desk, recognizing that this conversation needed to happen before I could truly move forward. Blake, what exactly do you think there is to save? You've been having an affair with my cousin for 8 months. You brought her to a family dinner to announce you were leaving me. Those aren't actions of someone invested in saving a marriage. He had the grace to look ashamed, at least momentarily. I made a terrible mistake, the worst mistake of my life. But people make mistakes, Ruby, even horrible ones. That doesn't mean they can't be forgiven, that relationships can't heal and grow stronger. The words were perfect, the exact right balance of accountability and hope, delivered with just the right note of humility. Classic Blake, hitting all the emotional notes with precision. 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, I might have been swayed. But the woman standing before him now saw through the performance to the calculation beneath. This isn't about forgiveness, I said quietly. It's about recognizing a fundamental incompatibility that I've been ignoring for years. Even before Jessica, our marriage was built on me becoming smaller to accommodate your need to be large. I can't do that anymore, Blake. I won't. That's not fair, he protested, genuine hurt flashing in his eyes. I've supported your career, your interests. As long as they didn't interfere with yours, I finished for him. As long as they remained secondary to your ambitions, your preferences, your vision of our life. Blake ran a hand through his disheveled hair, frustration evident in the gesture. What do you want from me, Ruby? I'm admitting I was wrong. I'm asking for another chance. What more can I possibly do? The question hung in the air between us, and I considered it seriously. What did I want from Blake? Not reconciliation, not anymore. Not even particularly vindication or justice, though the divorce terms would need to be fair. What I truly wanted was something he couldn't give me, couldn't even understand he had taken in the first place. I want myself back, I said finally. The self I surrendered piece by piece during our marriage. But that's not something you can give me, Blake. It's something I have to reclaim on my own. And the first step is moving forward with this divorce. Blake's expression darkened, the sincere remorse giving way to something harder, more calculating. And you've decided this unilaterally. No discussion, no counseling, no chance for me to make amends. You've appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner of our marriage. No, I corrected him. You did that when you started sleeping with Jessica, when you planned to leave me. I'm just accepting the verdict you already delivered. This isn't who you are, Blake said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. The Ruby I know wouldn't make such a drastic decision without at least trying to work things out. She's compassionate, forgiving, reasonable. The words struck me like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they illuminated so perfectly the dynamic that had defined our relationship. Blake wasn't describing who I actually was. He was describing the version of me he had cultivated. Compliant, accommodating, willing to overlook his transgressions for the sake of peace. "That's the thing, Blake," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "You don't know who I am. Not anymore. Maybe you never did." I picked up the box again and moved toward the door. This time he stepped aside, perhaps recognizing the futility of further resistance. But as I passed him, he reached out, his fingers brushing my arm, not forcefully, but with enough intent to make me pause. "I still love you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Despite everything, I never stopped loving you." For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the early days of our relationship, the genuine connection we'd shared, the hopes we'd nurtured, the future we'd planned together. There had been love there once, real and vibrant, but it had morphed into something unrecognizable, twisted by Blake's ego and my compliance until it hardly deserved the name. "I loved you too," I said simply. "But love shouldn't require one person to disappear so the other can shine." Without waiting for his response, I continued past him and down the stairs, each step feeling more decisive than the last. As I loaded the box into my car, I was aware of Blake watching from the doorway, a still figure framed by the house we had once shared. But I didn't look back as I drove away. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to see. The Ruby who had entered that house an hour ago was not the same woman who left it. I had crossed a threshold, moved beyond the possibility of return or reconciliation. The future stretched before me, uncertain but undeniably mine. As I drove to my parents' house, I pulled over once to send a brief text to my lawyer. Moving forward with divorce as discussed, no chance of reconciliation. Then I turned off my phone, severing the last tether to the life I was leaving behind. The point of no return had been reached, and despite everything, I felt lighter for having crossed it. 3 weeks after my return from the mountain cabin, I sat in my lawyer Emma Kingsley's office, reviewing the latest communication from Blake's legal team. Emma, a sharp-minded woman, in her 50s with a reputation for fair but formidable divorce settlements, frowned as she tapped a manicured nail against the document. "He's contesting the prenuptial agreement," she said, her tone suggesting this was both expected and irritating. "Claims it was signed under duress and doesn't reflect a fair division of assets acquired during the marriage." I leaned back in my chair, unsurprised yet still disappointed. The prenup was his idea in the first place. His family insisted on it to protect their assets. "Which is exactly why this challenge won't hold up in court," Emma assured me. "But it will delay things, which I suspect is precisely the point. Blake's playing for time." Time for what? I wondered. To wear me down? To hope my resolve would weaken? To find new leverage to pressure me into reconciliation? All seemed equally plausible given what I knew of Blake's strategic mind. In the weeks since our confrontation at the house, Blake had cycled through multiple approaches. First came the remorseful texts and voicemails, pleading for another chance. When those went unanswered, he switched to mutual friends as intermediaries, asking them to check on me, and subtly, or not so subtly, advocate for his case. When I politely but firmly shut down those conversations, he escalated to more dramatic gestures. Flowers delivered to my parents' house, a handwritten letter detailing all the ways he would change, even showing up at the library where I worked, with tearful apologies that left my colleagues uncomfortable and me mortified. Each attempt felt more desperate than the last, but also more manipulative, as if he were working through a playbook of tactics to regain control. None of them touched the core of me anymore. The Ruby who might have been swayed by such displays had been left behind in that mountain cabin, replaced by a woman who recognized these gestures for what they were. Performances designed to elicit a specific emotional response rather than genuine efforts at amends. There's something else, Emma said, pulling another document from her folder. Blake's claiming that certain assets should be considered separate property despite being acquired during the marriage. Specifically, the Riverside property investments, and his recent promotion bonus. I raised an eyebrow. The same Riverside project he was collaborating on with Jessica? Emma nodded, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. The very same. Which gives us interesting leverage, especially if we can demonstrate that their relationship might have factored into business dealings. I'm not looking to destroy him, Emma, I said quietly. I just want what's fair. Fair would have been your husband not sleeping with your cousin, she replied bluntly. We're well past fair. Now we're talking about equitable, and that means ensuring you're not disadvantaged by Blake's attempts to shield assets that rightfully should be divided. She wasn't wrong, but something about the escalating legal battle left me feeling hollow. This wasn't what I had wanted. This protracted, potentially ugly dismantling of a life we'd built together. I had hoped for a clean break, a dignified uncoupling that would allow us both to move forward without unnecessary pain or bitterness. But Blake, it seemed, had other ideas. There's one more thing you should know, Emma said, her tone softening slightly. Blake's requested a face-to-face mediation session. Outside of court, just the two of you with a professional mediator and your respective lawyers. He's claiming that direct communication might facilitate a more amicable resolution. And what do you think? I asked, watching her face carefully. Emma considered the question, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. Professionally, I think mediation can sometimes be productive, especially if both parties are genuinely interested in an equitable solution. Personally, she paused, choosing her words with care. I've seen cases like this before. When one party feels they're losing control, they often seek face-to-face meetings as a way to re-establish emotional leverage. That matched my own instinct. Blake couldn't reach me through texts or intermediaries or grand gestures. A mediation session would give him direct access, an opportunity to deploy the full range of his persuasive skills in person. I'll think about it, I said finally, gathering my purse. In the meantime, how do we respond to this prenup challenge? Emma outlined our counter-strategy as she walked me to the office door, her confidence reassuring. As I stepped into the hallway, she touched my arm lightly. Ruby, you're doing remarkably well through all this. Many clients in your position would be falling apart, especially given the personal complications of your situation. But don't hesitate to reach out if you need support beyond the legal aspects. Divorce is an emotional marathon, not a sprint. I thanked her and made my way to the elevator, reflecting on her words. The truth was, I did feel remarkably steady given the circumstances. The initial shock and pain had given way to a strange clarity, a purpose that carried me through even the most difficult moments. It wasn't that I didn't feel the hurt. It surfaced at unexpected times, like when I found Blake's favorite coffee mug among my belongings, or when a song we'd danced to at our wedding played in a store. But the hurt no longer defined me or my decisions. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and I stepped out into the bright spring sunshine, mentally reviewing my afternoon plans. I had an appointment with a realtor to look at apartments, followed by coffee with my friend Diane, one of the friendships I was actively rekindling after years of letting it fade under Blake's subtle disapproval. I was halfway to my car when a familiar voice called my name. Turning, I saw Jessica standing awkwardly by a nearby bench, clearly having waited for me to emerge from the building. My first instinct was to keep walking. I had successfully avoided any direct contact with my cousin since the disastrous dinner, letting her texts and voicemails go unanswered. But something, curiosity perhaps, or a desire for some kind of closure, made me stop. Jessica, I acknowledged, keeping my voice neutral. She approached cautiously, as if afraid I might flee, or possibly strike her, if she moved too quickly. Up close, she looked almost as worn as Blake had during our last encounter, her usual polished appearance diminished by dark circles under her eyes and a certain hesitancy in her movements. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," she began, "and I completely understand. What we did, it's unforgivable." I remained silent, waiting. Whatever Jessica had waited outside my lawyer's office to say, I doubted it was as simple as an apology. "Blake doesn't know I'm here," she continued, seeming unsettled by my lack of response. "Actually, we're not seeing each other anymore. Haven't been since that dinner." This was genuinely surprising. I had assumed they would cling to each other in the aftermath, justifying their affair with claims of true love that couldn't be denied. "Why are you telling me this?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Because I thought you should know. And because—" She hesitated, seemingly struggling to articulate her thoughts. "Because I'm truly sorry, Ruby. Not just for the affair, but for everything that led up to it. For the way I betrayed your trust. For the pain I caused." "Are you here on Blake's behalf?" I asked directly, suddenly suspicious of her timing and the convenient end to their relationship. "Did he send you to soften me up? Make me more amenable to reconciliation?" "No," Jessica protested, looking genuinely distressed at the suggestion. "God, no. If anything, he'd be furious if he knew I was talking to you. He's convinced I sabotaged everything by ending things with him right when he needed support." The pieces clicked into place. "So you left him, not the other way around." Jessica nodded miserably. After the dinner, seeing the way he handled everything, how manipulative he was, it was like suddenly seeing him clearly for the first time. And I didn't like what I saw. Jessica's revelation lingered in my mind as I drove to meet the realtor. The knowledge that she had ended things with Blake after witnessing his behavior at the dinner added a new dimension to the situation. But it didn't change the fundamental reality. My marriage was over, and no amount of context or explanation could resurrect it. The apartment viewing went smoothly. A modern one-bedroom in a renovated downtown building, walking distance from the library where I worked. It had none of the character of the craftsman home I was leaving behind, but perhaps that was appropriate. This next chapter of my life needed to be distinctly different from the one I was closing. "I'll take it," I told the realtor, surprising myself with the decisiveness. "When can I move in?" "The unit's available immediately," she replied, clearly pleased by the quick decision. "We could have the paperwork ready by tomorrow, and you could move in as early as next week." Next week. A concrete timeline for my new beginning. I signed the necessary preliminary forms, wrote a check for the deposit, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This tangible step forward, a space that would be mine alone, untainted by memories of Blake, felt like a victory, small but significant. My phone buzzed as I was leaving the building. A text from Diane confirming our coffee meeting, followed immediately by another from my mother. "Blake just left. He dropped off more divorce papers and asked about you. Your father sent him away but thought you should know." I sighed, tucking the phone back into my purse without responding. Blake's persistence was becoming increasingly intrusive, the legal maneuvers and personal visits forming a pattern that felt less like the actions of a man seeking reconciliation and more like someone unwilling to relinquish control. The coffee shop where I was meeting Diane was crowded, the afternoon rush filling every table. I spotted her in the corner, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose bun, a stack of papers spread before her, likely student essays from the high school English classes she taught. She looked up as I approached, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Ruby," she exclaimed, gathering her papers to make room. "God, it's good to see you. It's been too long." "That's my fault," I admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "I let too many friendships slide these past few years." Diane waved away my apology. Water under the bridge. Besides, I understand how it happens. Relationships take up space, and sometimes other connections get squeezed out, especially when your partner isn't exactly encouraging them. The gentle acknowledgement of Blake's influence touched me. Diane had always seen through him, had noticed the subtle ways he isolated me long before I recognized the pattern myself. It was one of the reasons our friendship had faded. Blake had found her too negative, too willing to question the perfect image of our marriage he worked so hard to project. Still, I said, I'm sorry, and grateful that you're willing to pick up where we left off. Diane reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Always. Now, catch me up on everything. The divorce, the apartment hunting, how you're really doing? Beneath that impressively composed exterior. For the next hour, I did exactly that. The words poured out of me. The discovery of Blake's affair, the confrontation at the dinner, my retreat to the cabin, and the ongoing legal battle. Diane listened, attentively, asking thoughtful questions, but mostly just providing the space for me to process out loud. "And Jessica actually sought you out to apologize?" she asked when I reached that part of the story. "That's unexpected." "It was," I agreed. "And I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it. Part of me wonders if it's some elaborate strategy Blake concocted, but she seemed genuinely distressed by how everything unfolded." Diane considered this. "People are complicated. Jessica did something terrible, unforgivable, really, but that doesn't mean she can't genuinely regret it or want to make amends. The question is whether her regret matters to you at all." "I don't know," I admitted. "Right now, I'm focused on moving forward. Processing Jessica's feelings or potential redemption isn't high on my priority list." "Fair enough," Diane nodded. "And what about Blake? You mentioned he's contesting the prenup. Do you think he's doing it to drag things out or because he genuinely believes he has a case?" I stirred my coffee, considering the question. "Both, maybe. Blake never does anything for just one reason. He's strategic, always thinking several moves ahead. The longer he can delay the divorce, the more opportunities he has to change my mind." "And is there any chance of that?" Diane asked carefully. "Of you changing your mind?" "No," I said without hesitation. "What Blake and Jessica did, it was a betrayal, yes, but it was also a revelation. It showed me how unhealthy our relationship had become, how much of myself I'd surrendered without even realizing it. There's no going back from that kind of clarity." Diane nodded, satisfied with my answer. "Good, because the Ruby I knew before Blake would never settle for being someone's second choice or consolation prize. I'm glad to see that Ruby is still in there." We parted with promises to meet again soon, the easy reconnection with Diane reinforcing my growing sense that life beyond Blake could be not just manageable, but genuinely fulfilling. The friendships I was rekindling, the new apartment, the gradual reclamation of interests and passions I'd set aside, all were pieces of a new mosaic I was constructing, one distinct from the life I'd shared with Blake. I was still contemplating this as I drove to my parents' house, the spring evening settling softly around the city. The days were growing longer, the harsh winter giving way to new growth, a parallel to my own transition that wasn't lost on me. My father's car was in the driveway when I arrived, but my mother's was conspicuously absent, unusual for this time of day, when they were typically both home preparing dinner together, one of their long-standing rituals. I let myself in, calling out a greeting as I entered. "Dad? I'm back from the apartment viewing. Where's Mom?" No answer came, but I heard movement from the living room. Assuming my father was engrossed in a book or perhaps on a phone call, I made my way down the hallway, already formulating how I would describe the apartment I'd just leased. I stopped short in the living room doorway. My father wasn't there. Blake was. He sat in my father's favorite armchair, an envelope on the coffee table before him, his posture tense despite his attempt at a casual demeanor. He looked up as I entered, his expression a careful blend of contrition and determination. "Blake," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "What are you doing here? Where are my parents?" "Your mother had a garden club meeting," he replied. "Your father got called in to help a friend with car trouble. They should be back in an hour or so." The calculated timing, waiting until I would be alone with him, sent a chill through me. "You need to leave. Now." "Ruby, please," he said, rising from the chair. "Just hear me out. 10 minutes, that's all I'm asking. Then I'll go if you still want me to." I remained in the doorway, maintaining the distance between us. "Anything you have to say can be communicated through our lawyers. You know that." "Some things can't be conveyed through legal documents," Blake insisted, gesturing to the envelope on the coffee table. "This is important, Ruby. It's about our future." "We don't have a future, Blake. Not together." "I signed a lease on a new apartment today. I'm moving forward with the divorce. There's nothing left to discuss." Something flickered across Blake's face. Surprise, perhaps, or frustration that I was continuing to deviate from his script. He hadn't expected me to have progressed so far in my plans without him, to be making decisions independently of his influence. "An apartment?" he echoed. "Ruby, that's ridiculous. We have a home, a beautiful home that we chose together. Why would you downgrade to some apartment when you don't have to?" The question was so perfectly Blake, focused on appearances, on what seemed appropriate or advantageous from a social perspective, rather than what I actually wanted or needed. It reminded me, with stark clarity, of how fundamentally mismatched we had become. "Because I want a fresh start," I said simply. "A place that's just mine, where I make all the decisions, from the color of the walls to the arrangement of the furniture." Blake took a step toward me, stopping when I instinctively tensed. "I know I hurt you," he said, his voice softening. "What I did with Jessica was inexcusable. But Ruby, we built a life together, a good life, despite my mistakes. Are you really willing to throw that all away without even trying to repair it?" The familiar refrain struck me differently now, heard through the lens of my growing clarity. Blake wasn't truly asking if I was willing to abandon our marriage. He was asking if I was willing to abandon the narrative he had constructed for us, the carefully managed image of a perfect partnership that had never actually existed. "This isn't about Jessica," I said quietly. "Or not just about her. This is about the fact that I don't recognize the woman I became in our marriage. The woman who silenced her own opinions to avoid conflict, who gave up friendships because you found them inconvenient, who stopped writing, stopped dreaming, stopped taking up space because you needed all the oxygen in the room." Blake's expression hardened, the facade of humble contrition slipping to reveal the frustration beneath. "That's not fair. I never asked you to stop writing or give up friendships. If you chose to do those things, that was your decision, not mine." And there it was, the subtle shifting of responsibility, the reframing that had always been Blake's specialty. In his version of our marriage, any sacrifices I had made were entirely of my own choosing, uninfluenced by his subtle pressure or disapproval. "You didn't have to ask directly," I replied, maintaining my calm despite the anger building inside. "Me. You just had to sigh heavily when I mentioned meeting Diane for coffee, or make dismissive comments about my hobby writing, or schedule client dinners whenever I had book club. Death by 1,000 cuts, Blake. That was your specialty." Blake's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching just below his temple, a tell I recognized from countless arguments over the years. It signaled the moment when his carefully constructed, reasonable facade began to crack, revealing the entitlement and anger beneath. "So that's it? You've constructed this convenient narrative where I'm the villain who suppressed you, And now you get to walk away feeling righteous? He stepped closer, his voice lowering to that intense register he used when trying to convey absolute conviction. Ruby, relationships involve compromise. Yes, maybe you set some things aside during our marriage, but I did too. That's what being part of a couple means. I held my ground, neither advancing nor retreating. What exactly did you compromise? Blake, your career always came first. Your preferences dictated our social circle, our vacations, even the neighborhood we lived in. Name one significant sacrifice you made for my happiness. The direct challenge caught him off guard. Blake opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly searching for an example that would prove me wrong. I supported your decision to take the head librarian position even though it meant less flexibility in your schedule. I couldn't help the laugh that escaped me, short and bitter. You supported my career advancement? That's your example of sacrifice? Most partners would consider that basic respect, not some grand concession. You're twisting my words, Blake insisted, frustration evident in his tone, making it sound worse than it was. We were happy, Ruby. We had a good life together. Yes, I made a terrible mistake with Jessica, but that doesn't negate the 5 years before it. The problem is, we weren't happy, I said quietly. At least I wasn't. I just became exceptionally good at convincing myself that the constraints of our relationship were normal, that the constant need to manage your ego and expectations was just what marriage looked like. Blake's expression darkened further, the last vestiges of his conciliatory approach evaporating. So now I'm controlling and egotistical? Convenient how your memory of our entire marriage has been rewritten since finding those messages. If things were so terrible, why didn't you ever say anything? The question struck closer to home than I cared to admit. Why hadn't I spoken up sooner? Why had I allowed myself to be slowly diminished year after year without protest? These were questions I'd been grappling with during my mountain retreat and in the weeks since. I did try, I said after a moment, memories surfacing of tentative conversations shut down, of concerns dismissed as overreactions. But you were always so certain, so convincing in your version of things. You'd make me doubt my own perceptions until I wasn't sure what was reasonable anymore. It's like that experiment with the frog in gradually heating water. By the time I realized how much I'd surrendered, it felt easier to keep surrendering than to fight my way back. Blake scoffed, reaching for the envelope on the coffee table. More convenient metaphors. You're determined to cast yourself as the victim in all this, aren't you? No, I said firmly. I'm not a victim, Blake. I'm a participant who's finally opted out of a dynamic that wasn't healthy for either of us. There's a difference. He shook his head, the stubborn set of his jaw indicating he wasn't absorbing anything I was saying. Look, this isn't why I came. I wanted to show you something. He opened the envelope and extracted a document, extending it toward me. I've withdrawn my challenge to the prenup. I'm agreeing to your terms for the divorce, with one condition. Cautiously, I took the paper from him, scanning its contents. It was indeed a formal withdrawal of his legal objections, along with a proposed settlement that matched closely what my lawyer and I had initially outlined. But attached was an addendum stipulating mandatory marriage counseling for a minimum period of 3 months before proceeding with dissolution of marriage. I looked up from the document, meeting Blake's gaze. Counseling? This is your play now? It's not a play, he protested. It's a reasonable request. 3 months of professional help before we make an irrevocable decision. If you're so certain, our marriage is beyond saving. What are you afraid of? What do you have to lose? The question was carefully crafted to corner me, to make refusal seem unreasonable, defensive, even cowardly. It was a tactic Blake had employed countless times during our marriage, framing his preferences as the obviously rational choice, so that any resistance on my part appeared emotional or irrational by comparison. 3 months ago, even 1 month ago, it might have worked. I might have questioned my resolve, wondered if I was being hasty or unfair by refusing such a seemingly reasonable request. But the woman standing before Blake now saw through the strategy with perfect clarity. "Time," I said simply. "I have 3 months of my life to lose. 3 months of moving forward, of rebuilding, of rediscovering who I am outside this marriage. 3 months that would be spent reliving hurts and betrayals to no purpose, because my decision is already made." I handed the document back to him, my hand steady. "No, Blake, I won't be attending counseling with you. File the withdrawal without the addendum, and we can proceed with the divorce as originally outlined. Or continue to contest it, and we'll let the courts decide. Either way, this marriage is over." Blake's composure finally shattered completely, the mask of reasonable negotiator falling away to reveal raw anger beneath. "So that's it? 10 years together, and you won't even try? Who are you?" "Because the Ruby I married would never be this cold, this calculating." "You're right," I agreed, surprising him. "The Ruby you married wouldn't have had the strength to walk away, to prioritize her own well-being over your approval. But I'm not that woman anymore. I've changed. Or more accurately, I've changed back. Into someone who recognizes her own worth, who won't accept betrayal or manipulation as the price of partnership." Blake stared at me, a mixture of disbelief and recognition dawning in his eyes. Perhaps, for the first time, he was truly seeing me. Not the malleable, accommodating wife he had shaped over the years, but the woman who had emerged from that cocoon, stronger and more determined than before. "You've already moved on," he said quietly, the anger in his voice giving way to something that might have been genuine hurt. "You made this decision weeks ago, and nothing I say or do is going to change it, is it?" "No," I confirmed gently. "It's not." Blake nodded slowly, folding the document and returning it to the envelope with methodical precision. The silence between us was heavy, but no longer charged with the same tension. Something had shifted. A final acknowledgement, perhaps, that the battle he had been fighting was already lost. "I did love you, Ruby," he said finally, his voice subdued. "In my way. It might not have been the right way, but it was real to me." For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for Blake. Not enough to reconsider my decision, not even enough to soften my boundaries, but enough to recognize the human complexity behind his actions, the insecurity masked by confidence, the fear of loss that drove his need for control. "I know," I said quietly. "I loved you too, but love isn't enough when it costs you yourself." 6 months later, autumn painted the city in shades of gold and crimson as I unlocked the door to my apartment, arms laden with groceries and a bouquet of dahlias I'd impulsively purchased from a street vendor. The space that had initially felt temporary, even transitional, had gradually transformed into a true home. My home, with every element reflecting my own preferences and choices. Soft gray walls showcased framed prints of my favorite literary landscapes: Pemberley, Thornfield, Hall, Manderley, alongside photographs from my recent weekend trips exploring nearby small towns and hiking trails. Bookshelves lined one wall of the living room, organized not by Blake's preferred system of color and size, but by my own more intuitive groupings of theme and emotional resonance. A writing desk positioned near the window overlooked the park. Across the street, its surface scattered with notes for the novel I'd finally begun writing after years of relegating my creativity to someday. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, Blake ultimately withdrawing his objections after our confrontation at my parents' house. The settlement had been fair, perhaps even generous on his part, whether from genuine remorse or a desire to expedite the process and preserve his professional reputation. I couldn't say for certain. The house had been sold, the proceeds divided according to the prenuptial agreement. The last I'd heard, Blake had accepted a position with a prestigious firm in Chicago, making a clean break from Lakeside and the whispered gossip that had inevitably followed our split. As for Jessica, Our paths had crossed only once since her unexpected apology outside my lawyer's office. At my great-aunt Maureen's 80th birthday celebration 2 months ago, we had exchanged brief civil greetings before naturally gravitating to opposite ends of the gathering. The tension had been palpable, but manageable, the family rallying, to create buffer zones, to ensure our comfort without explicitly acknowledging the elephant in the room. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a tacit agreement to coexist without dragging others into the lingering aftermath of her betrayal. I arranged the dahlias in a cobalt blue vase, a housewarming gift from Diane, and set it on the dining table, their vibrant colors brightening the already warm space. My phone chimed with a text from Kenneth. "Still on for dinner tomorrow? Elise is making that pasta you liked last time." I smiled, typing a quick confirmation. My relationship with my brother and sister-in-law had deepened in recent months, our weekly dinners becoming a cherished tradition. Kenneth had been my steadfast ally throughout the divorce, offering practical support and occasional comic relief when the legal proceedings became particularly frustrating. If he tries to claim the coffee maker you never even used, I'm personally driving to his office to demand justification, he'd declared after one especially nitpicky round of asset division. The groceries put away, I changed into comfortable clothes and settled at my writing desk, reviewing the pages I'd completed the previous evening. The novel, a story about a woman rebuilding her life after loss, had begun as thinly veiled autobiography, but had evolved into something more nuanced, more universal in its exploration of identity and transformation. My protagonist wasn't me, not exactly, though she carried echoes of my experiences transformed through the alchemy of fiction. Writing had become my anchor in this new reality, a daily practice that connected me to my authentic self after years of disconnection. The words didn't always flow easily, and some days produced more frustration than progress. But the act itself, of claiming time and space for my own creative expression, felt revolutionary after so long of treating my writing as an indulgence, to be fitted around the edges of real responsibilities. My phone chimed again, this time with an email notification from the library board, confirming my proposal for a new community program. A series of writing workshops for women in transition, whether through divorce, career change, empty nesting, or other life shifts. The idea had come to me during a conversation with my therapist, another new addition to my life, part of my commitment to processing the marriage and its aftermath in healthy ways, rather than simply pushing forward without reflection. Many women lose their connection to their own voice during relationships, Dr. Winters had observed during one of our sessions. Finding ways to reclaim and strengthen that voice can be deeply healing, not just for you, but potentially for others, experiencing similar transitions. The board's enthusiastic approval of the program felt like confirmation that I was moving in the right direction, that the painful dismantling of my marriage could yield something constructive, even beautiful. In its aftermath, the workshops would begin in January, a fitting start to a new year, a new chapter. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Puzzled, I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached cautiously and checked the peephole. Rita stood in the hallway, a casserole dish in her hands and a worried expression on her face that immediately set off alarm bells. My mother rarely made unannounced visits, and never looked this concerned without serious cause. I opened the door quickly. "Mom? Is everything okay? Is Dad?" "Your father's fine," she assured me, stepping inside. "Everyone's fine. I thought you might want some company tonight, and I brought lasagna." The forced casualness in her tone only increased my suspicion. "Mom, what's going on? You're a terrible liar. Always have been." Rita sighed, setting the casserole on the counter, before turning to face me. "I ran into Jessica at the supermarket. She mentioned that Blake is in town for a few days. Something about finalizing details with his old firm before his permanent move to Chicago." "Ah," I said, understanding dawning. "And you thought I might fall apart at this news? So you rushed over with emergency pasta?" My mother had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. When you put it that way, it does seem a bit overprotective. I smiled, genuinely touched by her concern despite its unnecessary nature. I appreciate the thought and the lasagna, but I'm fine, Mom. Blake being back in town doesn't change anything for me. You're sure? Rita studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of distress or uncertainty. It would be perfectly natural to have complicated feelings about it. The only complicated feeling I have right now is trying to decide whether to have salad or garlic bread with that lasagna, I replied lightly. Seriously, Mom. Blake's presence in Lakeside doesn't affect me anymore. That chapter is closed. And as I said the words, I realized they were absolutely true. The thought of potentially encountering Blake at a restaurant, on the street, in the park across from my apartment, didn't fill me with dread or anxiety, or even lingering anger. He was simply a person from my past, a character in a story that had concluded. Important once, certainly, but no longer central to my narrative. Well, my mother said, seeming both relieved and slightly surprised by my genuine nonchalance. In that case, the answer is obviously both salad and garlic bread. I brought those too, just in case. Winter descended on Lakeside with unusual gentleness that year, light dustings of snow transforming the city into a glittering wonderland rather than the harsh, bitter landscape we often endured. From the window of the library's community room, I watched a few stray flakes dance in the afternoon light as the women gathered their notebooks and pens, conversations continuing even as the workshop officially concluded. The writing program had exceeded all my expectations. What began as 12 participants had grown to nearly 20 women, ranging in age from 24 to 73, each navigating some form of significant transition. Some were recently divorced like me, others were facing empty nests or career changes or the loss of partners to death rather than dissolution. All were seeking to rediscover their voices after periods of silence or suppression. Ruby? Elaine, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who had joined the group after her husband's passing, approached with her notebook clutched to her chest. I wanted to thank you. Today's prompt about reclaiming joy, it helped me remember things I thought were lost forever. I smiled, touched by her words. I'm so glad. That's exactly what these workshops are meant to do. Help us reconnect with parts of ourselves that may have been set aside or forgotten. It's working, she assured me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For all of us, I think. You've created something special here. After Elaine left, I remained in the community room, gathering scattered handouts and straightening chairs. The prompt we'd explored today, write about a moment of unexpected joy you experienced during your transition, had yielded powerful responses, including my own reflection on the morning I'd woken in my new apartment and realized I could arrange my day exactly as I pleased, answering to no expectations but my own. That small freedom had sparked a kind of bubbling delight I hadn't experienced in years, a reminder that while transitions involved loss, they also created space for discovery and pleasure in the most ordinary moments. It was a truth I found myself returning to repeatedly as I navigated this new phase of my life. My phone vibrated with a text from Diane. Drink still on for tonight? Kenneth and Elise are joining too. I sent a quick confirmation before gathering my materials and heading to my office. The small space, with its wall of windows overlooking the library's courtyard garden, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I balanced my professional responsibilities with the creative projects that increasingly defined my personal life. The novel was progressing steadily, each chapter revealing new insights not just about my protagonist's journey, but about my own. Writing her story had become a form of meditation, a way to process my experiences through the protective lens of fiction. My therapist, Dr. Winters, had noted the parallel healing trajectories. As my character found her way forward, so did I. Fiction gives us distance to examine truths that might be too painful to confront directly, she'd observed during our last session. Your protagonist is both you and not you, allowing for perspective that can be hard to achieve when we're tangled in our own narratives. That perspective had proven invaluable, not just regarding my marriage to Blake, but in understanding larger patterns that had shaped my life long before he entered it. My tendency to prioritize harmony over authenticity, to shrink myself to fit others' expectations. These weren't traits Blake had created, but vulnerabilities he had exploited, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes with deliberate precision. Recognizing this distinction had been crucial to my healing. It allowed me to assume responsibility for my own patterns without taking blame for Blake's choices. It freed me from the binary thinking that had initially dominated my post-separation mindset, where either Blake was entirely villainous or our failed marriage was somehow my fault for not speaking up sooner, more clearly, more persistently. That reality, as always, contained more nuance. Blake had manipulated and betrayed me, yes, but I had also allowed myself to be diminished, had participated in the slow erosion of my own agency. We had co-created a dynamic that ultimately served neither of us well, though the harm it caused was undeniably asymmetrical. This understanding didn't excuse Blake's behavior, particularly his affair with Jessica, but it did illuminate how we had arrived at that breaking point, how the cracks in our foundation had formed long before the ultimate collapse. More importantly, it highlighted the patterns I needed to consciously avoid carrying into future relationships, romantic or otherwise. As I locked my office and headed out into the early winter evening, these reflections continued to unspool in my mind. The past year had been a masterclass in difficult wisdom, painful lessons that, while unwelcome, had ultimately shaped me into someone stronger, more self-aware, more intentional about the boundaries I established and maintained. The bar where I was meeting Diane, Kenneth, and Elise was a cozy downtown spot known for its craft cocktails and intimate atmosphere. Through the window, I could see them already seated at a corner table, heads bent in animated conversation. The sight filled me with a profound gratitude for these relationships I had reclaimed and deepened, for the support system that had carried me through my darkest moments and now celebrated my brightest ones. "There she is," Kenneth called as I approached the table. "The literary genius herself." I rolled my eyes at my brother's characterization but accepted the chair he pulled out for me. "Hardly a genius, just a librarian who writes on the side." "A published librarian who writes on the side," Diane corrected, sliding a cocktail menu toward me. "Don't downplay it, Ruby. That essay in the literary journal was significant." The publication she referred to, a personal essay about reclaiming one's voice after silence, had been accepted by a respected literary journal just 2 weeks earlier. My first official byline as a writer, the fulfillment of a dream I'd nearly abandoned during my marriage. The acceptance email had moved me to tears, not just for the validation it represented, but for the realization that I had finally given myself permission to prioritize this long-deferred passion. "It's just one essay," I demurred. Though secretly, I treasured the accomplishment. "It's a beginning," Elise said kindly. "And beginnings matter." They did indeed. As we ordered drinks and settled into comfortable conversation, I found myself reflecting on all the beginnings I'd embraced over the past year. The new apartment, the writing program, the rekindled friendships, the novel in progress, even the tentative dating experiences I'd recently allowed myself to explore, though nothing serious had yet emerged from these encounters. Each beginning had required courage, a willingness to step into uncertainty after the false security of my marriage. Each had demanded faith in my own resilience, my capacity to build something meaningful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. And each had confirmed, in ways both subtle and profound, that I was far stronger than I had believed myself to be during those final years with Blake. "A toast," Kenneth proposed, raising his glass once our drinks arrived. To new chapters and the courage to write them ourselves. I'll drink to that, I agreed, clinking my glass against theirs. As the evening progressed, our conversation flowing, from serious topics to ridiculous jokes and back again, I realized that this moment of easy connection, of belonging fully to myself while also being genuinely present with others, was perhaps the most valuable wisdom I had gained from the entire painful journey. The understanding that authentic relationships don't require self-diminishment, but rather flourish in the soil of mutual respect and genuine seeing. It was a truth worth every difficult step that had led me here, every tear shed, every moment of doubt weathered. A truth I would carry forward into whatever chapters still awaited me, now that I had finally learned to hold the pen with confidence. 1 year to the day after Blake had brought Jessica to that fateful family dinner, I stood on the shore of Lake Michigan, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the rippling water. The spring breeze carried the faint scent of awakening earth and new growth, a fitting metaphor for the journey I'd completed over the past 12 months. I hadn't planned this anniversary visit deliberately. My literary agent, a recent and still somewhat surreal addition to my life, had arranged a meeting with a small publisher interested in my novel, now completed and polished through multiple revisions. The coincidence of the timing struck me only as I checked into my hotel, the date on the registration form triggering a cascade of memories. 1 year. 365 days since I had watched my marriage unravel in the most public and painful way possible. Since I had experienced the twin shocks of betrayal and revelation, each cutting in their own way but ultimately leading to liberation. Chicago was Blake's city now. I knew this from occasional updates that filtered through mutual acquaintances. He had established himself at the prestigious architectural firm, thrown himself into high-profile projects, begun rebuilding his life, in a place where his reputation wasn't colored by the messy dissolution of our marriage. We hadn't spoken since finalizing the divorce 9 months earlier. Our last interaction a brief, formal email exchange, confirming the transfer of the final assets. Part of me had wondered if I might glimpse him during my visit. Chicago was vast, of course, but coincidences happened. I had examined this possibility from various angles, searching for any lingering dread or anxiety it might provoke, but I found none. The thought of encountering Blake now felt neutral, perhaps mildly awkward, but ultimately inconsequential. He occupied a different mental category entirely, no longer the central figure around whom my world revolved, but a character from an earlier chapter, significant in his time, but no longer decisive to my story's direction. My phone chimed with a text from Diane. "How did the meeting go? Are they buying your brilliant masterpiece?" I smiled, tapping out a response. "Very promising. They're sending an offer next week. I'll call with details when I get back tomorrow." The meeting had indeed gone remarkably well. The editor's enthusiasm for my novel. Reflections, a story of a woman's journey from invisibility to self-reclamation, validating in ways I was still processing. Publication was far from guaranteed. Contracts were complex entities, and first novels rarely launched spectacular careers. But the simple fact that my words had resonated with a professional reader, had been deemed worthy of investment and broader audience, felt like the closing of a circle that had begun with those first tentative journal entries at the mountain cabin a year ago. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, I left the lakefront and walked toward a small cafe I'd spotted earlier. The warmly lit interior welcomed me with the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries. I ordered a cappuccino and found a quiet corner table where I could watch the passing parade of locals and tourists outside the window. Opening my journal, a habit I had maintained religiously since my retreat, I found myself writing not about the promising meeting or potential book deal, but about the significance of this anniversary and all that had changed since that night. 1 year ago today, I thought my life was ending. In reality, it was just beginning. The words flowed easily, a reflection not of pain, but of perspective gained through distance and deliberate healing. I wrote about the woman I had been then, already diminished by years of subtle erasure, then shattered by Blake's betrayal with Jessica. About the gradual rebuilding of identity, the reclaiming of passions and relationships and dreams that had been set aside. About the strength I had discovered within myself, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed until circumstances demanded. Yet I was so absorbed in my writing that I didn't immediately notice the woman who had entered the cafe and now stood hesitantly near my table. When I finally glanced up, recognition struck me with physical force. "Ruby," Jessica said softly, her expression a complex blend of surprise and uncertainty. "I thought that might be you." For a moment I simply stared, wondering if I had somehow conjured her through my reflections. But Jessica was undeniably real, standing before me in a tailored coat, her hair shorter than I remembered, her posture tense as she awaited my response. "Jessica?" I acknowledged, closing my journal and setting down my pen. "This is unexpected." "I'm attending a marketing conference," she explained quickly, gesturing vaguely toward downtown. "I saw you through the window and—" She trailed off, seemingly unsure how to complete the thought. An awkward silence stretched between us, laden with all that remained unspoken. The last time we had been alone together had been that brief encounter outside my lawyer's office. Her unexpected apology still hanging in the air between us, neither fully accepted nor rejected. "Would you like to sit?" I finally offered, surprising myself as much as her. "Just for a minute." Jessica hesitated, then nodded, slipping into the chair, across from me. Up close, I could see subtle changes in her, a new maturity in her eyes, a certain gravity that hadn't been there before. The year had clearly shaped her as well, if in different ways. "How are you?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm good," I replied, finding that I meant it genuinely. "Really good, actually. I'm here meeting with a publisher about my novel." Jessica's eyes widened slightly. "You wrote a novel? That's amazing, Ruby. You always talked about writing someday, but—" She stopped abruptly, perhaps remembering that her awareness of my deferred dreams came partly through Blake, through conversations they shouldn't have been having. "Yes," I said simply. "Someday finally arrived. What about you? Are you still with the marketing firm?" Jessica nodded, seeming grateful for the redirect. "I was promoted to strategy director last month. It's challenging, but fulfilling." Another silence fell, less awkward, but still weighted with the elephant in the room. Finally, Jessica met my gaze directly. "I've thought about you often," she said, quietly. "About what happened, what I did. I know my apology that day was inadequate and probably unwelcome. But I want you to know I truly am sorry, Ruby. Not just for the affair, but for betraying your trust as family. There's no excuse for it." I studied her face, searching for the sincerity behind her words. What I found wasn't performative remorse or strategic contrition, but genuine regret, the kind that comes from difficult self-examination and growth. "Have you seen Blake since?" I left the question unfinished, realizing I wasn't even sure what I wanted to ask. "No," Jessica answered firmly. "Not since ending things after that dinner. He tried to contact me a few times during your divorce proceedings, but I didn't respond. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed, but some mistakes once recognized don't have to be repeated." The wisdom in her words struck me, not because it absolved her of responsibility for the pain she had caused, but because it reflected a parallel journey of reckoning and growth. Jessica had made terrible choices, had participated in the betrayal that catalyzed the collapse of my marriage, but she, too, had faced consequences and emerged changed by them. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive what happened," I said honestly, "but I'm not carrying the anger anymore. It takes too much energy. Energy better spent on building something new. Jessica nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's more than fair. More than I deserve, probably. As she rose to leave a few minutes later, having declined my reflexive offer to stay for coffee, Jessica paused, seeming to debate whether to say something more. He's not happy, you know, she said finally. Blake. From what I hear through mutual friends, he's successful in Chicago. But something's missing. I think he finally realizes what he lost. Who he lost. I absorbed this information with a strange detachment, neither pleased by Blake's apparent discontent nor troubled by it. His happiness or unhappiness had ceased to be my concern, a liberating truth that had taken months to fully internalize. I hope he finds his way, I said sincerely, just as I've found mine. As I watched Jessica leave, disappearing into the stream of pedestrians outside, I felt an unexpected sense of closure, not just regarding her betrayal, but regarding the entire chapter of my life that had concluded a year ago. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. It had transformed into wisdom, into growth, into a deeper understanding of both my vulnerabilities and my strengths. I reopened my journal, returning to the reflection I had begun before Jessica's appearance. The final lines came with perfect clarity. 1 year ago, I stood in the wreckage of a life I thought was mine, only to discover it had been built on compromises that diminished my true self. Today, I stand in the foundation of a new life, one constructed choice by choice, dream by dream, word by word. The architect of this life isn't Blake or Jessica or anyone else who once claimed power over my happiness. It's me. It has always been me. I just needed to remember how to hold the pen and write my own story. I closed the journal and watched as the last golden light of day painted the Chicago skyline in hues of amber and rose. Tomorrow I would return to Lakeside, to my apartment, my writing desk, my community of friends and family who had supported me through this transformation. But I would return changed, stronger, clearer, more fully myself than I had been in years. The woman who had once stood frozen in humiliation at a family dinner, watching her marriage publicly unravel, had become someone new, or perhaps more accurately, she had become herself again. The self that had been waiting all along, beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation, ready to emerge when the moment finally arrived. That moment had come disguised as catastrophe. But looking back now, with the perspective of a year's growth and healing, I recognized it for what it truly was: liberation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.